when I was growing up, whites were called white folks. I mean, it was one word. They were white folks. And people who were not very cultured or who had no pretensions to the niceties of the world called them po white trash. That was one word also. It seemed to me, we blacks, we Negroes, we colored folks were humans. And white folks were those others. They were other than. And as a child, I was certain that white folks didn't have innards. They were all, their bodies, their heads and their bodies were empty, that you could put your hand on a white folks and your hand would go right through them. That was my belief. They seemed so different. They walked differently. Every action from white folks was an action of disrespect, cruelty, scorn. So they couldn't be just. Now, mind you, I read about white people in other places, and I believed them. I was a fond reader of Charles Dickens, and so I wept with the children and laughed with the Micawber and Oliver. I mean, I've in fact read Horatio Alger Jr. And I was that little white boy. I understood him. I understood being lonely and deprived and almost forced upon one's own resources, which were negligible, if at all. But I didn't connect those people with white folks. I just didn't. There were women who worked as maids for white folks, and they would bring laundry over into the black area, and they would stop at my grandmother's store quite often and put the baskets down. And I wanted so to go through those. You know, what kind of things did they have? But the only venturing into our area by white folks took place when people would come over to pick up cotton pickers. Cotton pickers used to gather in the clearing in front of our store. And the white folks would come over either in trucks or wagons and pick up the cotton pickers. And one could see them then. I could see them. And they talked. They didn't have what the West Africans in Senegal, the Serer and Tukulur, call la langue doux, the sweet language. I never heard white folks use sweet language, and I always heard black people use it. So the sweet language was a language dependent entirely upon tone, and even the lengthening out of a word. So if I spoke the sweet language to you in the South, instead of saying, "Hi there, how are you?" I'd say, "Hey, how you doing?" Well, I never heard white folks use sweet language, and I heard black people use it all the time, even though they didn't call it that. You simply did it. At the turn of the century, my grandmother, with 2 sons, left and divorced my grandfather in this little village in Arkansas. White women didn't get divorced at the turn of the century, but my grandmother divorced my grandfather. And she had to raise the 2 boys. So she made meat pies from either canned sausage, or which she canned, or chicken, or ham, smoked meats. She would make them up in the night, and then at midday she would appear at the cotton gin, which was on one side of town, and the lumber mill was on the other side, 5 miles apart. My grandmother would fry the meat pies there in front of the cotton gin. And as the dinner bell rang at 12 o'clock, the men would come down and buy these hot meat pies for 5 cents. If she didn't sell them all, she would wrap the rest of them, turn the brazier of hot coals out, dig a place in the sand and leave it there, and run 5 miles to the lumber mill, where she'd sell them tepid for 2 cents. But the next day she would be at the lumber mill, and she'd sell them hot, fresh, for 5 cents. After she built up a substantial clientele, she built herself a stall between the two, so the men could run to her. And there began her store. She in the end bought most of the land behind the town, much of the land in the town. She was really a West African market woman. I didn't know that till I lived in West Africa. The store was the center of the black town, the non-religious center, the lay center. There was a Willie Williams Dewdrop Inn. There was a kind of roadhouse, but a place where all the people could come. That place was my grandmother's store, but she didn't name it her store. She named it for her son, my uncle, who was crippled. My uncle was crippled. The whole right side of his body was paralyzed and had been since he was 3. Mama thought he was crippled because he'd fallen off a porch. He was crippled because of some neurological malady. But Mama named the store the W.M. Johnson General Merchandise Store, so that my uncle was never at the sufferance of a larger society as a black male in the South and crippled. So that was his store. On Saturday, women came there and had their hair curled. There was a big chinaberry tree in the yard, and so women sat there and they had crokinole curls put in. The barber would come and do haircuts around the chinaberry tree. The Gandhi dancers, who were the men who worked on the railroad, would come over to the store and buy their Coca-Cola and cheese and sardines and crackers. And the blues singers would come when they were walking through Arkansas. And their sound, I learned, I think, to speak in my mind because of the sounds of the South, the sounds around the store and in the church. From the time I was 7.5 until I was almost 13, I was a mute. But I listened, I just took in sound. During the Depression, the troubadours were as peripatetic as were hobos. However, they didn't catch freights because they carried their instruments. And their instruments sometimes were wash tubs and sticks in them and catgut. So they had wash tub bases. They could break them down, but they couldn't jump trains. They couldn't catch freights. They had cigar box guitars, literally, cigar boxes with the fret made of a piece of wood, and catgut strung. And the fellows from Texas, from the Brazos, black, sounded different from the fellows from Mississippi, from the Delta. So they come around the store on a Saturday and sing. When, even before a lynching, when a black man had been accused of something which terribly offended the white community, the news went around the black community like a string of Chinese firecrackers being set off. I don't know how it got around so fast. And then a pall, a cloud of gloom and fear would settle over the community. Like a heavy blanket being put over a light, like a little candle. And people, you could see it, you could sense it, but you could also see it in the sag of the people's shoulders when they'd come into the store and just shake their heads. And I'm sure it is exactly the same universal sense of loss and fear and dread and terror that obtained in Russia when the pogroms were rife in the shtetls, when people knew, here they come, the Cossacks are coming. Whenever the boys, as they were euphemistically called, the Klan would ride into the black area, all black men had to hide. And my brother and I would take potatoes and onions out of the bin. The bin was under the candy counter. And we'd take potatoes and onions out of the bin and knock the partition out, which separated them. And my uncle would take his stick, holding on to his stick, and laboriously get down into the bin. And my brother and I would cover him with potatoes and onions. And he would lie there all night until we couldn't hear the horse's hooves, or the truck, which would ride over and by its very presence be a threat. I thought my school was grand. It was the Lafayette County Training School, so there. It was first grade through the 12th, one building. No, there was the second building, a home economics building. Because I went downtown occasionally, and downtown was an area with one block of paved road and one block of sidewalks. And I saw the white school, which was like 4 times larger, and bricks and all that. But I don't remember envying that. I mean, that was white folks. That had nothing to do with me. Until Mrs. Flowers, who is the woman who started me really to reading. I mean, I had learned to read, but to enjoy it. When I stopped speaking, this black lady took me in hand. She knew I liked to read, and she encouraged me to read every book in the black school, in the library, starting with A. And after a few months, she would come and ask me how far I'd gotten, and I'd gotten to BR or something. And I had a tablet, which I kept in the belt of my clothes, and I would write how I liked or didn't like. And I didn't understand that much, but I read every book. Well, she had some connection with the white school. And from time to time, she would bring books, and they were new. That was so unusual to me, because we used the thrown away books, the books with the spines broken, or with one cover gone. And I learned to repair books, because black kids did that. We would get cardboard, and cover the cardboard with cloth, remnants that were around, and make cooked glue with, not just flour, but cooked flour and water to make glue, put a little coal oil in it, and put that on the back, the spine of the book, maybe even use wood. By the time the book was finished, it looked lovely, So we learned to do that, but I had never seen a new book until Mrs. Flowers brought books from the white school for me to read. The slick pages, I couldn't believe it. And that's when I think my first anger, real anger, at a depressive and oppressive system began. I was angry at the way people treated my mama, my grandmother, who owned the land they lived on. I was angry at that, but that was a personal anger because of their maltreatment of mama. But when I saw that the white kids had these fresh books, it was so unfair, because I loved books. And I deserved them. And just because I was black, I couldn't have them. There's a bitter and yet wry statement which was made by blacks about the Depression. They said in the South that the Depression had been going on for 10 years before black people even knew about it, even knew it existed. And that was true, particularly in the South, in villages, in small hamlets and small towns, because the people lived at a subsistence level, for the most part. Many were sharecroppers, and that line in the popular song of a couple of decades ago, it was absolutely true. They owed their lives to the company store. So, because they hadn't been able to get education, then they were vulnerable to the greed and evil of the farm owners. So at the end of a year, the farmer found himself not even, he found himself in debt. So the Depression had gone on long before the crash of '29 took place. I think that I imagine that the large hordes of men walking around the country had some effect on the black community. And this is interesting. One of the ways it affected the black community was that the white hobos would come to the black area to ask for food. Now, partly out of pride, and maybe the other part out of an ability to identify, to empathize with the hobo. Black people always gave food. Now they had beans, maybe, with a little piece of smoked meat, or dried meat, cured meat. They had cornbread. And black people would give beans and cornbread to black hobos and white. So at the railroad line, they would come to the black area first. Because of the general subsistence level in the southern states, non-industrialized areas, black people did not depend upon industry or upon Wall Street for anything. They depended upon the earth. They were farmers and sharecropping farmers for the most part, so that they were not really affected in a large way. Maybe subtly, yes, but it wasn't until the end of the 30s, the beginning of the 40s, with the advent of World War II, when black people left the South and went into the shipbuilding and ammunition plants, that they began to en masse be able to be a part of the market. There were great differences in the quantity and the quality of life in the black communities 40 years ago. Great differences 50 years ago. The things one could hope to own were minimal compared to today's black community. I mean, even in poor areas, a black community can today count on there being certain things in the house. There will be a television in the house. There will be probably a VCR, and there will be a stove in the house. There will be a refrigerator in the house. There will even be a bathroom in the house and a toilet in the house. People will actually have clothes. They may not be the newest clothes, they may not be the most expensive clothes, but people will have clothes. Now, so here we are talking about things. When I grew up, and in the South of that time, a house was considered all right if it had a floor and walls and windows. Now, that was all right. The floor would have no rugs. The floor would be washed once a week with lye water so that the wood came up white. And that was always a mark of pride for the housekeeper, that her floors were white wood, because they were so clean. The toilet was outside. The bath was a big tub in which heated water was poured once a week. There were places one washed up during the week, but the real bath to sit down in water. And one didn't turn on the faucet or the tap. There was a well, and one drew up the water. There are qualitative differences in things. However, there was in the black community a sense of unity, a sense of pride, a sense of love. There was a a communal sense of religion and morality. People simply didn't do certain things because it wasn't nice to do certain things. Children were loved and looked after. I don't know anybody who ever abused a child. I mean, children got spanked, children got whipped, children got talked to pretty roughly, set over in corners and so forth. But to abuse a child? This is absolutely new in the black community. Never before until the last 2 or 3 decades had we heard of people actually burning children and hurting them. Not that there wasn't sexual abuse. I don't mean that. I cannot say that. But even that was not as rife. Children were so valuable, and everybody took pride in all the children. So any woman or any man was subject to call the child away and say, "Child, who's your mama? Who's your papa? Come here. I don't like the way you..." I was grown. I came back from Europe. I was a dancer. I was the first dancer with Porgy and Bess, and I was a grand young woman. And I had cut my hair off because my hair was very thick and I couldn't dance and keep my hair in a certain kind of style. I went into San Francisco and a man saw me on the street. He said, "Are you Clydell and Vivian's daughter?" I said, "Yes, sir." He gave me $5. He said, "Go do something to your hair." Now, that sense of interdependence and humor in Stamps, Arkansas, by the time I was 10 years old, I expected my brother to become a lawyer. He was 1.5 years older than I. He was brighter than I. I didn't expect that for myself because I didn't talk. There was a fellow, Henry Reed, in my school who was almost as bright as my brother, also a little bit smarter than I. I figured that he was going to be a doctor. Now, although the people in my town did not boast of a number of black doctors and lawyers, but I did know that Fisk existed, university, Fisk University, and Howard University existed. And Tuskegee and Atlanta and Spelman, Morgan State in Baltimore, and Morris Brown and Morehouse. These were heavenly abodes. I mean, I kind of thought that if a child was good and died, the child would go to heaven and become an angel. And if the angel was a good angel and died, it would probably go to Howard. That was possible. And it was something to dream of. And black teachers took such pride in black students. And the community took such pride in smart students that a child who had gotten A's would be marched from one church to another. And people would say, "Now here's his brother so-and-so's little boy. Here he is, here's little Johnny. Stand up, Johnny. Johnny got all A's this week, or all A's this past year." So people took pride in the children, and their pride was an encouragement to continue. So we thought, with the larger society saying, "You cannot," we thought, yes, we could, because somebody had gone before us. Dr. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey. Those were names in this little village in Arkansas, which were very familiar. Ida Wells, Barnett. We knew these names. we knew, and Miss Mary McLeod Bethune, oh, please. And that was genius walking around, and Grace. So the aspirations, I don't think the aspirations were that much different from today's aspirations. The only thing is that we aspired against incredible odds. If a child graduated from Lafayette County Training School, she or he would have a very good underpinning in Black American literature. You would know Paul Laurence Dunbar, James Weldon Johnson, Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Anne Spencer. You would know the 19th and 20th century writers. One might not know mathematics very, very well, or have even been introduced to science other than the name George Washington Carver, because the teachers had themselves not been trained in the hard sciences, and they couldn't afford to get teachers, Black teachers, from the North, or who really had a training, because they could go to better paying schools, you see? So the students came out of the high school without the underpinning they needed, the foundation. They could go on maybe to a church college and get some more training in social services. But to try to get to Columbia University or to Howard, it wasn't that easy. They needed maybe 2 more years of like a junior college to come up to, just to compete with the people in the other schools. That was always an obstacle, because families needed their children to work. And children who felt responsible to their families wouldn't take 2 more years, you see? There was a white man who really came to speak and to inform the graduating class that they were going to have a new playing field, basketball field, and an addition to the home economics building. So I thought, oh, so this is to say we can become athletes, and we can become better cooks and more adept washerwomen and men. But to aspire to be scientists and philosophers and mathematicians and doctors seemed to be beyond us, because the man also insensitively informed us that the white school had been given 50 new microscopes. So obviously we were being told, don't you aspire beyond these limitations.